You said something wrong about the church in the Middle Ages, so the Inquisition is after you now. They've used a leather strap to secure a device that looks like a two-way fork with two sharp points on your neck. One of its sides is pushing against your sternum, and the other against your chin. At first, you tried to keep your head up to lessen the pain, but you couldn't stay like this for long. The so-called heretic's fork wasn't deadly, but made the victim suffer from the tiniest move. However, on the scale of pain based on scientific research, this kind of suffering gets only 27 points out of 140. In this video, you'll find out about the worst kind of torture in the history of humankind. So, viewer discretion is advised. You have at least a few
hit the like button, hit the like button. Y'all want to see my
It's just that the executioner wasn't persistent enough.
Reaction content.
In ancient China, this was the primary method of punishing delinquents from noble families, since tickles didn't leave any traces of torture on the body. And the victim was able to recover quite fast if the procedure didn't go too far, of course.
Unconscious from tickling?
In European countries, goats were employed as a torture device. The culprit was tied up, and salty water was poured on their feet to make the animal lick them. What's so bad about that, you might ask? It's just that there's an incredible number of nerve endings in the feet, and the goat's rough tongue would irritate them quite a lot.
Okay.
So, after a few hours, the tickling starts inducing not just laughter, but also painful muscle contractions. You lose virtually all control over your body, which causes extreme stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. Moreover, the nerve endings responsible for reacting to tickles also signalize pain. It's just that if we're being tickled for fun, and for a short time, our reaction to stress doesn't go beyond laughter and light sensations in the body. However, if done for hours, this causes the nervous system such overload that the lightest touch causes unbearable physical pain. Now imagine that.
Oh no, man. Tickle me for hours and it starts to turn from feeling good, it starts to turn into pain. I don't know. I don't know if I believe it.
Your feet being tickled.
I don't know if I believe it.
Private parts. In India, interrogation of criminals was accompanied by placing a small bug on the culprit's genitals and covering the insect with a walnut shell so that it didn't escape. The constant irritation of super-sensitive areas caused by the bug's movements made the torture unbearable very quickly, and the executioners got any confession they wanted. Eventually, tickle torture would result in death by asphyxiation if the victim developed a throat spasm caused by uncontrollable laughter. Other possible outcomes were cardiac arrest or a brain aneurysm provoked by serious...
Ain't no way, bro. Uncontrollable laughter? You die from uncontrollable laughter? Ain't no way, man.
Stress. Yet on the pain scale, tickle torture got only 32 points since the suffering it brought was mostly psychological. This is very similar to the next kind of torture.
Ain't no way.
Chinese water torture. At first, the person was immobilized, and then cold water would slowly drip onto their face.
Oh yeah, I've seen this before.
Gradually, the constant skin irritation caused by the drops and splashes would make the nervous system hypersensitive.
It just keeps tapping your forehead.
The inability to move.
The water drops.
The next drop would literally start driving the person insane. Maybe you've even seen this torture in movies. Here's the paradox though. There's no proof that it was ever used in China. This kind of torture was first described by an Italian lawyer on the cusp of the 16th century. In the mid-18th century, German and French doctors attempted to use this method to cure mental disorders. Moreover, the very term Chinese water torture came into active use owing to a trick by the legendary Harry Houdini.
Who comes up with these things?
Does the water drop torture actually work? Since it can look harmless at first glance, a few bloggers have dared to try it out themselves. The water drop torture was also tested by the Mythbusters. All participants knew they were actually perfectly safe and could be freed at any moment. Yet everyone went through a hellish experience. At first, the experimenters suffered from cold, thirst, psychological tension, and physical discomfort. Then their entire bodies started leaking, and breathing problems arose.
I could do it, bro.
It all ended in a panic.
I could do it, bro.
Pleas to be released.
This ain't shit.
The worst.
In addition,
this ain't shit. I could do it.
The Mythbusters received an anonymous letter whose authors reportedly found out that the Chinese water torture may cause mental issues that persist for 20 hours. So, on the pain scale, the water drop torture received 40 points, and a huge question as to whether...
Bro, I could do it, bro. I play Madden. I literally play Madden, so my pain tolerance is very high. So
was actually used in
I
practice,
could do it.
at least because it was replaced by much crueler kinds of water torture. One of them was the Swedish drink. This name was invented by the Germans. During the 30 Years' War, they became victims of the Swedish army servicemen, mercenaries,
Swedish
or
drink.
marauders. This method of torture went as follows. Through a funnel, the perpetrators would pour buckets of the most disgusting liquids imaginable into the victim's throat. They used everything from urine and filth to manure and feces. This was the Swedes' way of torturing the civilians, to force them to give up their money or food. Not only did the victims feel disgust and humiliation from being subjected to the Swedish drink, they also contracted deadly diseases.
Yeah, of course.
Furthermore, their stomachs stretched, causing horrific pain. The perpetrators would often use wooden planks to put pressure on the victim's bloated belly, or hit it with sticks to deepen the suffering. So, on the pain scale, the Swedish drink got 46 points out of the possible 140. Very often, one kind of torture...
That's not even torture. You're just fucking
accompanied by
just messing with someone right there.
To a death punishment with unbearable suffering. One of such hellish inventions was the king. It's a large board consisting of two halves with a hole between them, used to keep the device on a person's neck. The king wasn't secured in any way, so the culprit had to support the board with their hands and balance it while walking. To intensify the punishment, the person in a king could also be chained, stopping them from ever sitting down. Moreover, the king's parameters would change according to the severity of the punishment. It could weigh anywhere from 9 to 15 kilograms and have a square, rectangular, or disproportionate, irregular shape. Sometimes they were even double or triple. Often a king would be so large that the victim would be unable to touch their face to eat or drink. If they weren't helped by those who cared, the victim would die a slow death of hunger and thirst. Yet the king was also used as an execution device. The convict was placed inside a tall cage made specifically for this purpose. A king would be secured above. Then, a prop would be taken from under the victim's feet, and they would slowly be strangled with a cord on their neck.
Oh, man.
That's how people were executed in China
as
recently as 1900, suffering excruciating pain.
That's terrible.
Pain scale, king torture sits at 62 points.
Yeah, that one is.
However, even
that one is cold.
Is far from being the worst thing people ever came up with. Europeans during the Middle Ages were especially creative in their acts of cruelty. It was then that they invented and actively used a contraption called the Judas cradle. It's a spiky wooden or metal pyramid secured on a support with a special clamp over it. First, the victim's arms and legs were tied, and then their trunk was secured with a metal ring attached to the ceiling or the wall with ropes. After this, the person was slowly seated on the pyramid's sharp point. I won't go into the horrific anatomical details, since it's clear anyway that the process caused unbearable pain. Moreover,
does that go in their butt?
On for days. If the executioners wanted to receive a confession or other information, but the victim remained silent, they tied weights to their arms and legs, causing the pyramid edges to gnaw at the poor person's body even more. As if that wasn't enough, the Judas cradle was never cleaned, so it became the breeding ground for deadly bacteria.
So does it go in their butt or what? I don't know.
So, even if the victims managed to survive, they often died of infections. At any rate, they remained scarred physically and psychologically for the rest of their lives. That's why the Judas cradle received 79 points on the pain scale, crossing the midpoint. However, the first device to go beyond 100 in our list.
So how did they even measure these pain scales? Is it someone actually went through all this and then they all did a report or something? Is that what happened?
It's a horizontal tunnel with the only way out in the form of a grated opening above, used as a dungeon.
Oubliette.
Often, it was so narrow that the prisoners couldn't even sit down. Moreover, oubliettes were built right there in the castle so that the victims could hear human voices and smell the food, causing them even more psychological suffering. Yet, the real torture was the fact that the prisoners were literally forgotten about in these holes, and they slowly died of thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and infections. Compared to this, a Judas cradle execution was a swift way to relieve one's suffering. The oubliette is a kind of immurement, which has been practiced since ancient times on all continents. In the Roman Empire, the most influential Vestals who had broken their virginity pledge were sentenced to death. It was against the law to shed their blood, though.
Damn.
So they were immured alive, fated for a slow, desperate death. If you think this insane practice remained in days past,
get killed for losing your virginity?
In Mongolia,
damn,
this barbaric execution method was still in use until at least 1913. So immurement in its different variations receives 108 points on the pain scale. But what if you're not alone in this closed space? Then it's an entirely different kind of punishment. Rat torture.
Rats.
As far back as in the 1st century AD, the cruelest emperor in the history of the Roman Empire, Nero, used rats to torture those who fell out of favor. They say he put the victim into a barrel with hungry rats who quickly ate the person alive. In India, they made criminals wear wide pants, which were first tied around the ankles and then filled with rodents. Any ideas as to which body parts suffered the most and how painful it was? However, medieval torturers took it even further. They tied the victims down to immobilize them, then placed a bottomless cage on their abdomens and filled it with rats. Then they put hot wood coal on the grates, and the rats became unbearably hot. First, they tried gnawing at the cage in desperate attempts to escape. Later, though, the rats realized they were standing on a soft human body and started eating their way out through it. Sometimes the cage was put on the victim's head, near the mouth, or other body parts. I'll let your imagination fill in the details. The most horrible thing is probably the fact that in South American countries, rat torture was in use until the 1980s. It received 112 points on the pain scale. It would seem that there's nothing worse than this.
I'm not really scared of rats. Like some people, I see some people like they have videos of them when they see rats in the house, they're running away and shit like that. I'm not really scared of rats. I don't know.
But before we get to the most horrifying tortures that scored the maximum of 140 points, there are still 2 more devices. The first of which is the rack. This is another deadly invention of the Middle Ages. It looked like a wooden frame with rollers on both ends. The person's limbs were tied to them, and when the torturers would start turning the rollers, the victim's arms and legs would stretch in different directions. This caused unbearable pain due to joint displacement, muscle and ligament ruptures, and, in the most horrific cases, even bone fractures. The executioners could torture the victim like this for hours or even days to beat the confession or the necessary information out of them. Sometimes, a specifically trained person would supervise the victim's condition to keep them conscious and alive before a specific time. So, it's unsurprising that just threatening someone to send them to the rack would often be enough to obtain the necessary information. This horrible type of torture received 116 points on the pain scale. However, citizens of ancient Greece managed to outperform even the cruelty of medieval European torturers, being the creators of one of history's most terrifying torture devices, the brazen bull. According to stories, it was built by an Athenian named Perilos as a commission for a Sicilian tyrant, Phalaris, in the 16th century BC. It was a hollow copper statue of a bull with a hatch on its side. A person would be pushed inside, the hatch would be shut, and then
you just burn alive.
Torturers would start a fire under the bull's belly. Furthermore, the statue's nostril structure made the victim's scream sound like the bull's bellow. Yet this barbarism was apparently not enough. So after the execution, the victim's bones were used to make jewelry to then be sold on markets. The inventor of this hellish machine realized very quickly that doing business with tyrants was a bad idea, since the first person Phalaris tried out the brazen bull on was Perilos himself. First, the man's skin started burning in the places where it touched the metal. Then, the hot air gradually burned his airways and lungs. He went on to slowly cook alive before choking to death or going unconscious.
But wouldn't the metal
Perilos went through the agony
melt?
That reached 130 points on the pain scale. Even this horror, though, won't compare to the fate of those sentenced to lynching. It's definitely one of the most barbaric punishments in humanity's entire history, and it hails from Asia. It was used in China, Vietnam, and Korea right until the early 20th century to punish perpetrators of the most heinous crimes like mass murder and high treason, as well as to eradicate the emperor's personal enemies. It comes as no surprise since the victim would be tied to a pole.
Why you got a COVID mask on? This ain't 2020. Why you got a COVID mask on?
It comes as no surprise since the victim would be tied to a pole in a crowded space to turn the execution into public humiliation. Then, a few torturers would slowly cut pieces of flesh out of the convict's arms, legs, and chest. We know from historical records that during Ling Chi, the victim would suffer from 100 to 3,000 wounds. That's why this torture is also dubbed death by 1,000 cuts. Although the experts state that with such wounds, a person would most likely die within 20 minutes. Sometimes the families of the victims would bribe the executioners to inflict a deadly wound right away. This wouldn't remove the victim's physical pain, but it's worth remembering that for the Chinese, Ling Chi was also a spiritual punishment. According to their beliefs, this disfigurement of the body wouldn't allow the victim to be whole and healthy in the afterlife. This horrific execution method officially remained in use in China until 1905. This type of torture received the most points on the pain scale, 140. I told you all this exclusively for educational purposes and to tickle your nerves. But I hope it didn't reach torture level. If you enjoy experiencing extreme sensations without putting yourself in danger, you'll find many exciting videos on my channel.
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, hit the like button if y'all want to see more reaction content. And I catch y'all on the next one.